So now we're going to look at the West and farmers in the Gilded Age. As you can see from the cover slide for this PowerPoint, is we're going to have a change over time in the American West. We're going to see at the start of the time period, Native Americans are going to be inhabiting the Great Prairies, and then by the end of the time period, they're going to be replaced by white Americans who are going to be homesteaders or pioneers who are living on the prairie trying to grow wheat. So we're going to start with Native Americans. Letter A, Native Americans in the West. Says, number one, a way of life challenged by. So let's take a look at the Native Americans. Native Americans in the West, especially on the plains, they were heavily dependent on the American bison, the buffalo. The bison provided their shelter. Teepees were made from bison hide. It provided food. It provided clothing. They used the bladder of the buffalo to carry water around. Just about everything that Native Americans on the Great Plains needed was provided by the buffalo. And we're going to see that as white Americans move west onto the Great Plains, they're not going to want to have these giant buffalo herds around. And so there's going to be a concerted effort to destroy the American buffalo. As we can see here by this picture on the bottom right, all of these, it's a famous picture, all of these are buffalo skulls. We may have had millions and millions of buffalo roaming the Great American Plains at the start of this time period, but by the end, there'll be just a few thousand left in the United States. Partially, this was because, like I said, the American pioneers don't want to have buffalo trampling over their crops, but also they don't want to be attacked by Native Americans. And the United States government knew that Plains Indians are so dependent on the buffalo that if they kill off the buffalo herds, you can also kill off the Native Americans. The Native Americans just won't have a food source or shelter or anything like that. So not only do we get rid of the buffalo because we want to have farmland, we also get rid of the buffalo because it'll get rid of the Native American threat to pioneers on the Great Plains. So let's continue that thought. So here we see in the top right-hand picture, we see a Native American, and he's looking out and he sees the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, to which this poster refers to as the Iron Horse, the train. And so we see here that not only are we going to kill buffalo, but we see how is the Transcontinental Railroad tied into this. As the United States is building the Transcontinental Railroad, we see that that is going to allow more and more settlers to move west, which means that the life of the Plains Indian is going to quickly diminish and then become extinct and go away. All of these before, if you wanted to move west, you had to get on a wagon train and follow the Oregon Trail or the Santa Fe Trail, Mormon Trail. And it was a slow, arduous process. And yes, many white Americans came out west on the trail, but it was a very hard thing to do, and so the numbers were limited. But now that we have the Transcontinental Railroad, it becomes much easier to pack up your family, pack up your supplies, and move out west in record time. And so we see the West is going to be quickly settled by white Americans, which means they're going to come in conflict with Native Americans on the prairies. In addition to that, the United States is going to send out federal troops. So as conflict over land occurs between the railroad companies and settlers and Native Americans on so who gets to control the land, we're going to see that there's going to be some Native American uprisings. There's going to be some conflict between Native Americans and white Americans over who controls this land. And the United States government is going to send troops out to protect the railroad companies, but also American settlers. And so this brings up the point of the role of the federal government in settling the West. Without the United States government, it would have been extremely difficult to settle the far west. The United States government passes the Railway Act of 1862, basically handing out cheap loans to railroad companies to build the Transcontinental Railroad, but also giving them land grants to help pay for the cost of the railroad. Without this help, it would be doubtful that the railroad companies would have been able to build the road as quickly as they did. In addition to that, the United States government sends out federal troops to protect settlers from Native American raids. And then finally, later on, in the early 1900s, we're going to see the Newlands Act, where the United States government will take it upon itself to build irrigation projects and reservoirs to help farmers farm the dry, arid West. So without the United States government, it would be very difficult to settle the West. So this leads us into the Indian Wars. From the 1860s to the 1880s, the United States government will engage in a 30-year-long war against Native Americans in what's called the Trans-Mississippi West, basically from the Mississippi River to California. The goal of these wars is to just remove Native Americans from the land that they're on, and either to kill them or to put them on reservations that'll be out of the way of white Americans. And the reasons this is occurring is because the United States increasingly is moving west, wanting to take advantage of the Homestead Act, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so more and more white people are moving west. And of course, like I said, this causes conflict. And so this conflict between Native Americans and white Americans is going to be known as the Indian Wars. So let's take a look at a few examples of these Indian wars. Now, these wars are going to be very violent, right? I mean, most wars are, but this one is going to be even more so in some regards because Native Americans are fighting for their very lives, and white Americans are fighting for what they see as a second chance, a way to move out west and support their families and escape whatever they were fleeing from the East Coast or so forth. And so we see one of these in 1864 as we see the Sand Creek Massacre. This happened in Colorado, and there was a massacre, or there was some killing of some homesteaders, some pioneers near the Denver area. And so the local population found out about this, and they took the bodies of these homesteaders into Denver and put the bodies on display, which had been mutilated by the natives, on display in a hotel lobby in downtown Denver. So the governor of Colorado, he wants payback, he wants revenge, and so he says that we're going to go out and we're going to get the people responsible for this. But the problem is we don't know which exactly Native Americans did this, and so it's easy to just, well, let's just find the first Native Americans that are available. And so they know that there are some Native Americans camped at Sand Creek. They're camped there, as you can see in the picture, because the United States government promised these Native Americans that if you camp at this place, we'll protect you. We want to be able to keep an eye on Native Americans, and so some Native Americans did come in and camp at Sand Creek because of all this conflict that is going on. They wanted to avoid conflict, and they said the United States government promised that they would be safe there. Well, the governor of the Colorado and the 1st Colorado Regiment know that there are Native Americans here. We don't know if they're the ones that are responsible for this killing of these homesteaders, but they're Native Americans. They're there. Let's go ahead and attack them. And so we see that the United States, that the 1st Colorado Regiment lines up, and they rush into the village and kill men, women, children. And just like the settlers were mutilated by the Native Americans, a lot of the troops engaged in some pretty horrendous activity and mutilate some of the Native Americans, cutting off ears and noses and displaying them as trophies and those kinds of things. And so we see this very violent, very personal in some ways, conflict on the Great Plains. Another massacre, although in the opposite direction, is the Battle of Little Bighorn. In 1876, the Sioux Nation, that's a Plains Indian tribe, they're in the Dakotas, and they had been told by the United States government that they could have the Dakotas, that was going to be Native American land, because it's pretty cold up in the Dakotas, and not a lot of white settlers wanted to move there. But then something happens. There's gold discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and so white miners pour into the Indians' area, and so we see conflict between the Native Americans and these gold miners who were coming in looking for gold on the Native Americans' land. So there's conflict, and so the United States Army is sent in, the 7th Cavalry, under a command by the name of General George Armstrong Custer. Well, Custer makes a series of bad decisions, and he is surrounded by over 2,000 Native Americans, and they kill almost all, if not all, of his troop, of his cavalry regiment. And so we see, and almost nobody left alive. There's some people say that a few people escaped, but for the most part, his command is wiped out. And so again, we see that this is very personal. We're not going to leave survivors, that kind of thing, on both sides. Now let's continue with the example of the Nez Perce Indians. The Nez Perce are Indian Native Americans that live up in the Montana region, and their leader is a guy by the name of Chief Joseph, pictured below. And they were on their way. Chief Joseph was having them on their way to go join the Sioux uprising that we have just talked about. And you can see the route that he takes from Montana as he's headed towards the Dakotas. And then you notice about when they get to the border of Wyoming, in the northwest corner of Wyoming, they take a left and they start moving towards Canada. This is because Chief Joseph found out that the Sioux Indians he was on his way to meet, after the Battle of Little Bighorn, more U.S. troops poured in and put down the uprising. And so he is afraid that the United States government is going to find out that he was on his way to support the Sioux Indian uprising, and so he needs to get out of the United States before the United States government has payback. And so he takes his people, and they're headed towards the Canadian border. But now the chase is on. The United States Army tracks him down, and they surround the Nez Perce, and Chief Joseph famously says that he will fight no more. And so the Nez Perce are put on a reservation. He figures either it's that or have all of my people possibly killed in a massacre. And so we see that the Nez Perce, along with a lot of Native Americans, are put on small corners of land called reservation, that they're tucked out of the way from where white settlers want to move. And we see that about 40% of his people will die on this reservation. So we'll talk more about the reservation system and why it takes such a death toll on people at this time. So as we go around America on the plains, we're fighting these battles, and slowly, tribe by tribe, we're defeating Native Americans and putting them on these reservations. And then one of the last significant Native American uprisings or attempts to resist white settlement is in the Southwest, and we see this Native American from the Apache tribe known as Geronimo. You can see in the picture some of the cactus and so forth. That kind of helps you see that it's in the Arizona area. And so Geronimo, he's trying to resist white settlement into his region. So these are not Plains Indians, these are Indians of the Southwest. And he's able to escape capture by the United States Army because he has horses, so he's very mobile. He also has modern guns, and so he's able to do some hit-and-run attacks, and it's very hard attacks, so it's very hard for the United States Army to capture him. Eventually, however, the women and children of the Apache Indians are going to be captured, and Geronimo is convinced that it's better for his people if he surrenders, and so he eventually does. And for the most part, that's going to end Native American uprisings. Later on, there's going to be this Native American revival that is happening at this time. It's kind of a last-ditch attempt by Native Americans to save their culture, and it's called the Ghost Dance Movement. And we see this among Plains Indians primarily, and there's this idea that there's this white buffalo out there, and that's a sign from the nature spirits and the ancestors that they should band together and rise up, and they'll be able to restore their culture and perhaps even move the white people out of their land and get their culture back. They think that they're going to be impervious to bullets, that the nature spirits will protect them. And of course, this makes when they have all these ceremonies of the ghost dance movement, this makes their white neighbors very nervous. And so the United States government comes in and puts down the uprising. So if we look at this picture, it's a pretty interesting picture, a series of maps, and it shows you land that was settled primarily by Native Americans and by white Americans. In 1790, in the top left-hand corner, most of the land in the United States was still under Native American control. And then we get to 1860, and you notice that white America is certainly on the East Coast in the Mississippi Valley, and they've also jumped over the middle and are living on the West Coast, and that's because of the gold rush, and so we see lots of white Americans living on the West Coast and the Oregon Trail. But for the most part, not a lot of settlers were going to settle in the inter-region between the Mississippi River and the Sierra Nevadas or California. It's just so dry that not a lot of farmers are attracted to it. But then the United States government in 1862 passes this thing called the Homestead Act, which we'll talk about in a minute. It basically gives free land to people who want to move out west. And so there's this great rush to get out west and take advantage of that free land, hence the Indian Wars. And by 1880, 1890, we see that Native Americans are quickly going to lose their land and be put on reservations in remote areas of the United States. Until we look at the map on 2000, we see that this is a pretty current map, that Native American Indian reservations are small. They're dispersed throughout the West, and they're in small areas where it's either too cold or too hot for a lot of white Americans to farm, and so the land is not wanted, and so that's where we're going to kind of tuck away the Native American population so that they're out of sight and out of mind and not causing quote-unquote trouble for the rest of the United States. And we'll talk about, again, some of the difficulties living on these reservations. And so the reservation system. And so what we're going to use here is the example of Oklahoma. So here we have in the top right-hand corner a picture of Oklahoma. It's part of the Great Plains. It's flat. It's pretty dry in areas. And so we're going to place Native Americans on this land because, like I said, not a lot of white Americans want to farm this. What you see on the left-hand side is all the way going back to Jackson's era, where it was the Indian Removal Act, and we're going to take Native Americans from whether the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears or the Seminole Indians, and we're going to remove them far away from the land that they know how to live on, they can hunt on, and they can grow crops on, and we're going to move them to Oklahoma, which is where the Cherokee and the Chickasaw and the Choctaw and the Seminole Indians, it's not like their native environment, and they don't know how to survive here. And so a lot of Native Americans are going to struggle on the reservation because they're in a climate area that they just don't know how to survive on. It's not part of what they're used to. And so they don't know how to survive there. They don't know what animals to hunt. They don't know how to plant crops there, so forth and so on. Next, because Native Americans are on this area that they don't know how to survive on, they're going to struggle. They're going to have a tough time feeding themselves. Even some Native Americans who live in the Southwest, who are used to a desert climate, they're still going to struggle to survive because the land that they're put on is so small that you can't be a hunter-gatherer on this land, or it's very dry and it's not the most choice land you could use. So it's hard to find animals, and it's even going to be hard to grow crops because it's just so dry. And so the United States government gets put in charge of taking care of the Native Americans once they're put on these reservations. And you remember, this is the Gilded Age, so this is a time when there's a lot of corruption in government. So adding to Native Americans' problems on the reservation of not being able to feed themselves is the United States government we see in this picture. This is the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That's a government organization that's responsible for taking care of Native Americans on the reservation. And so in this picture we see the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they've brought in the food for the Native Americans, and it's going to be dispersed and handed out to them. But the problem is, during the Gilded Age, there's lots of corruption in the government. And so let's say I'm a Bureau of Indian Affairs Indian agent, and it's my job, let's say Congress gives me $10,000, I'm just making that number up, but they give us $10,000 to go buy food, shelter, blankets, those kinds of things for the Native Americans on this reservation. But what I do, since it's a time of corruption, is I pocket most of that money just for myself, and then I go and I buy rancid food from some factory, or I buy blankets from some secondhand store, though they're all holey and rotten and those kinds of things, and that's what I provide for the Native Americans. And so we see that Native Americans will starve on these reservations, not only because they don't know how to survive there, it's not the climate, or it's too dry, but also because the food they're getting from the United States government is often not enough, or it is spoiled food and blankets and those kinds of things. So this creates a lot of hardship for Native Americans. In addition, that there's a psychological component here. If you were once a proud warrior and you're able to take care of your family and be independent, and now you're completely dependent on your enemy, the United States government at the time, this creates a feeling of hopelessness among Native Americans. That, there's no hope for me in the future. It's not like I can get off this reservation. It's not like I can change my future. I'm being forced to stay on this reservation. I can't get off. I can't have a better life for me or my children. And so it creates despondency, hopelessness. And sometimes, no matter what your culture, when people have to face a lack of hope, there is a tendency for alcoholism and drug abuse later on, poverty. And so these reservations are not not a good place at all to be on for Native Americans. And we'll see, as we talked about the Nez Perce, we'll see lots of Native Americans perish and struggle to survive in this reservation system. And so, just like there are other reform movements in America at this time, in previous lectures we talked about the education reform movement, temperance reform, the City Beautiful movement, all of those things. We're going to see that some Americans, some white Americans, are also going to see what's going on the reservation and think, oh my gosh, this is horrible, how can we fix this? And so we get the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. It was an attempt to try to aid Native Americans on the reservation because they see that they're languishing and they're struggling and they're not prospering. And so they thought, as just in many reform movements of this time, the best way to help, whether they're immigrants or whatever, the best way to help people fit into American society and be successful is to force them to assimilate, to be like white America. And so that's what the Dawes Severalty Act is. It's an attempt to aid Native Americans and help them be more successful by forcing them to give up their native culture. And that's where the term from this act called "kill the Indian to save the man." Right? We're going to destroy Native American culture, turn them into people who will practice white culture so they can fit into society and be more successful. So it's forced assimilation. So in order to do that, you have to end tribal structure. The Native Americans were used to sharing land, sharing resources among the tribe, And so here we see this big blue area, and it's supposed to be representative of, let's say, a reservation. And the Native American tribe that lives on this land, they share all of that land among the group. But that is not the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American way. White America believes in individual ownership, working hard, rugged individualism, those kinds of things. And so they say in this act, look, Native Americans, what we're going to do is we're going to divide up your land into 160-acre lots. So instead of owning the land communally, what we're going to do is we're going to make you own it individually, and after 25 years of farming the land, that land will be yours. So that's what they did. They divide up the land among Native American families, 160-acre lots. They say, don't be a hunter-gatherer, you have to be a farmer like the rest of America. And what they found out is, lo and behold, after they divided up this land, right, so let's say we divide up this land, and what we found out is when we did that, there was all kinds of extra land left over. There just weren't enough Native Americans left on this reservation to occupy everybody get 160-acre lots. And so we have this extra land. And so because of the Dawes Severalty Act, the reservation is actually getting smaller because the United States government is going to just sell or give away the rest of the land that the Native Americans weren't using because we have this extra land. So we see that that's a problem. Reservations are going to get smaller, and they're going to force Native Americans to assimilate into white culture. And then we also see that as part of this reform movement, we're going to say that Native American children have to be educated in schools that are operated by white Americans. And so we're going to say, look, in order to really fit into America, you're going to have to give up your culture. So we've already dealt with the tribal part of the culture, and so now let's have you stop speaking Apache or Arapaho or Ute or Sioux or you name the language. And so we're going to have you stop speaking the language of your tribe's past. We're going to make sure that you're Christians, that you're not an animist anymore. And so we're saying we're going to try to change the culture of Native Americans with young people as well as older people. So older people are going to start farming, and younger Native Americans are going to start assimilating by being Christian and also by learning English and those kinds of things. So we see that Native Americans are going to continue to struggle, and we'll come back to Native Americans when we talk about the Indians' New Deal, or when we talk about the New Deal and Franklin D. Roosevelt. So that ends part one. When we get back to part two, we'll talk about the white settlement of the West and what groups came and how they made money in the West.